Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Latin American Poetry Club that we organize in the Institutos Cervantes in Manchester and Leeds. Today, we travel to a small country like Uruguay, which has writers of reference such as Ida Vitale, Eduardo Galeano, or Juan Carlos Onetti. But this afternoon, we are going to dedicate to one of the most influential poets in the 20th century, Mario Benedetti. He's a prolific author with more than 80 books, translated into more than 20 languages, and a reference of the so-called generation of 45, with fundamental poems such as No te rindas. As on other occasions, our book club is presented by Diana Cullell, professor at the University of Liverpool. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the session. Diana, all for you.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's lovely to see familiar faces and familiar names again. So, as Carlos said, today we will be looking at the work of Mario Benedetti, and I've got the English translation of his work by Louise Popkin. So I've got the poems in a document that I'll put through the chat, and they are also on the PowerPoint so that we can look at both the original and the translation. So before we jump to read the poems and talk about them, just a reminder, so I'll just talk for about 5 minutes. I'm sure that Mario Benedetti doesn't need an introduction. He's one of the most famous poets from Latin America, but I'll talk a little bit about his poetry, and then we will probably read 3 poems. We'll see how we do with time. You'll see that in the document that I'll put through the chat, there are a few more poems just in case there is extra time or you want to read them at home in your own time. And as always, feel free to stop me. This is supposed to be a reading club. Everyone is welcome to contribute with ideas, thoughts. We will all interpret the poems in different ways. There is not a single right answer. So all of us will have a different opinion, a different point of view, and they might all be correct. So whatever I say is not the rule. And I do welcome, all your thoughts and ideas. So let me put in the chat, first of all, the poems. Again, another month of us in this Latin American Poetry Club. And tonight we will be looking at the poetry of Mario Benedetti from Uruguay. For those of you who are not familiar with Benedetti's work and life, he was born in a small town in Paso de los Toros in 1920 and died in Montevideo in 2009. He was an extremely prolific writer and journalist. And when I say prolific, I really, really mean extremely prolific. So he wrote short stories, novels, essays, poetry, and obviously today we will be looking at his poetry. So in here, I've listed some of his main publications, just a handful. There are many, many, many more. And these are only his poetry publications, okay? There are plenty more around. He spent over a decade in exile, living in Argentina, in Peru, in Cuba, in Spain, both in Madrid and Mallorca in the Balearic Islands. So he went into exile in 1973 after a coup d'etat in Uruguay when he was 53 years old, and went back to Uruguay in 1985. So we will see how this idea of exile, of not belonging, or never feeling completely at home is very, very prevalent in his writings. But we will also see the influence of Cuba in particular in his poetry. He was awarded multiple awards. He was also made Doctor Honoris Causa, an honorary fellow in multiple universities in Chile, in Spain, in Cuba, all over the world, and received all these literary awards. And again, I've listed only a handful: the Medalla Gabriela Mistral in Chile, 1995, the Gran Premio Nacional a la Actividad Intelectual from the Ministerio de Educación y Cultural in Uruguay, Premio Reina Sofía de Poesía Iberoamericana in Spain, Premio Internacional Menéndez Pelayo also in Spain, Medalla Pablo Neruda in Chile, and these are just some of the awards he received. As Carlos said in the introduction, he forms part of the Generación del 45, the generation of 45. And we'll see in his poetry different ideas about life, exile, pessimism, optimism, really humane values. So he's a very social writer, very, very committed with society. And we will see all that in his verse. I've copied here a short quotation from the Biblioteca Virtual Miguel de Cervantes, where Remedios Mataix talks about his poetry or his writing. And she says that his communicative writing, and I translated this as communicative, but maybe that's not the right word. The Spanish says comunicante, so this communicating way of writing that he had cast a spell of seduction on readers through the depth of emotional truths of its characters, the questions often posed by its lines, and the depth of its reflections. The outcome is a resonance that cancels all geographical or generational differences. And he has really been lauded, let's say, for precisely this, for making his poetry accessible to everyone. Even though he talks about events in Uruguay, in Latin America, these cancels, these travels across geographical and generational differences and borders, and really, really manages to get to the reader. So we will see how he manages to do that. I said that we will be using the translations by Louise Popkin. This book witnessed the selected poems of Mario Benedetti, and he was involved in the translation. So Louise did consult Benedetti on some of the translation issues, and we know that he was very pleased with what he saw, and he, I'm sure, would love this. But there is an introduction in the book by Margaret Randall that is really, really interesting. And I just selected a few quotations from there that I think encapsulate really well what Benedetti's poetry is like. So Margaret Randall, in the introduction, says, Mario's poetic language seemed straightforward, but we knew it hid allusions and meanings that we would have to coax from between the lines. So we will see this poetry that seems very simple at first value, but there is so much more behind it. She also says that his allegiance to humane values was solid. His early poems reveal a characteristically Uruguayan, or more accurately, Rioplatense pessimism. Though he would credit Cuba with making him an optimist, his innate pessimism would remain a feature of much of his later work, often functioning in tango step with his acquired optimism and lending a distinctive quality to his poetic voice. So we will see the fight between pessimism and optimism in his poetry. He showed an uncanny ability to capture the essence of his countrymen and women, their sensibilities, yearnings, sorrows, idiosyncrasies, irony, and measured optimism. His politics embodied his own courage and dignity in defense of human rights and his defiance of those who usurped those rights. So Margaret Randall highlights this ability to capture the essence of his people, but at the end of the day, that's common to everyone, and that his politics were very present in his poetry, his defense of human rights, etc. When he wrote about politics, Margaret Randall says, his voice wasn't cliched or weighted by slogans, but reflected the loves, aspirations, and accents of his people, and by extension, people everywhere. When Mario wrote about exile, he expressed not only the unique laws of home and landscape, of elsewhere through the eyes transplanted by inhumanity and violence. He imbued weather and the objects of everyday use with a bottomless urgency. And when he wrote about political disappearance, that particularly Latin American brutality lingering in the lives of so many, he opened a window onto a reality few can even imagine. So this is what we will encounter in his poetry: pessimism, optimism, humane values, exile, a critique to governments. So this very deeply social poetry. So let's go and see, some of this poetry we've talked about. The first poem I've selected for us to read is this poem called Un Padre Nuestro Latinoamericano. It's from Poemas del Hoy por Hoy, written between 1958 and 1961. And the reason why I chose this poem is because I think that obviously it will sound familiar. The whole poem is a word play with El Padre Nuestro, your Father who are in the heavens. I don't know the version in English, but you will, you certainly will. And it's a reconstruction of the prayer of the Padre Nuestro, but in a very I wouldn't say playful way, but you will know what I mean once we read it. It's the poem talks about people getting forgotten, about abusing power, about how powerless people can be at the hands of really bad governments. So it's also a poem that I chose because Mario Benedetti, I mentioned when we talked about his life, worked as a journalist. So he was very, very much present. The current events were very much present in his day-to-day. And let's remember, the 20th century in Latin America, there were quite a few, the revolutions, La Revolución Mexicana, but also in other Latin American countries, we had caudillos, there were, the world wars, the First World War, the Second World War. So this is basically a complaint to really horrible governments and how people can suffer in their hands. So you do have the translation, but I'll read the Spanish, and then if someone wants to read the English version, I'll ask you to read it. So, Un Padre Nuestro Latinoamericano. Padre nuestro que estás en los cielos, con las golondrinas y los misiles, quiero que vuelvas antes de que olvides cómo se llega al sur de Río Grande. Padre nuestro que estás en el exilio, casi nunca te acuerdas de los míos. De todos modos, donde quieras que estés, santificado sea tu nombre. No quienes santifican en tu nombre, cerrando un ojo para no ver las uñas sucias de la miseria. En agosto de 1960 ya no sirve pedirte venga a nos tu reino, porque tu reino también está aquí abajo, metido en los rencores y en el miedo, en las vacilaciones y en la mugre, en la desilusión y en la modorra, en esta ansia de verte pese a todo. Cuando hablaste del rico, la aguja y el camello, y te votamos todos por unanimidad para la gloria, también alzó su mano el indio silencioso, que te respetaba, pero se resistía a pensar hágase tu voluntad. Sin embargo, una vez cada tanto, tu voluntad se mezcla con la mía, la domina, la enciende, la duplica. Más arduo es conocer cuál es mi voluntad, cuándo creo de veras lo que digo creer. Así en tu omnipresencia como en mi soledad, así en la tierra como en el cielo, siempre estaré más seguro de la tierra que piso que del cielo intratable que me ignora. Pero quién sabe, no voy a decidir que tu poder se haga o se deshaga, tu voluntad igual se está haciendo en el viento, en el ande de nieve, en el pájaro que fecunda la pájara, en los cancilleres que murmullan yes sir, en cada mano que se convierte en puño. Claro, no estoy seguro si me gusta el estilo que tu voluntad elige para hacerse, lo digo con irreverencia y gratitud, dos emblemas que pronto serán la misma cosa. Lo digo sobre todo pensando en el pan nuestro de cada día y de cada pedacito de día. Ayer nos lo quitaste, dánosle hoy, o al menos el derecho de darnos nuestro pan, no solo el que era símbolo de algo, sino el de miga y cáscara, el pan nuestro, ya que nos queda pocas esperanzas y deudas. Perdónanos si puedes nuestras deudas, pero no nos perdones la esperanza, no nos perdones nunca nuestros créditos. A más tardar mañana saldremos a cobrar a los fallutos, tangibles y sonrientes forajidos, a los que tienen garras para el arpa y un panamericano temblor con que se enjugan la última escupida que cuelga de su rostro. Poco importa que nuestros acreedores perdonen, así como nosotros una vez por error perdonamos a nuestros deudores. Todavía nos deben como un siglo de insomnios y garrotes, como 3000 kilómetros de injurias, como 20 medallas a Somoza, como una sola Guatemala muerta. No nos dejes caer en la tentación de olvidar o vender ese pasado, o arrendar una sola hectárea de su olvido. Ahora que es la hora de saber quiénes somos y han de cruzar el río, el dólar y su amor contra reembolso, arráncanos del alma el último mendigo y líbranos de todo mal de conciencia. Amén. It's a very long poem. It's actually the longest one we will read, but I thought that it was a great poem to start because it's playful. You know what I mean now that you've read it. It's this constant wordplay with the prayer, with the Padre Nuestro. And you can trace it in the lines, but obviously having the poetic voice has an input in it and adds the lines to suit his message. So you have the translations. I'm sorry, I had to take a picture. I didn't have a scanner at hand, so I had to take a picture of the different pages in the book. I don't know if it's clear enough. And whether we have a volunteer that wants to read the poem in English. So what do you think of this poem? Obviously, as I said, we've got the Lord's Prayer in it in different lines, but the input of the poetic voice questioning God or questioning why he is abandoning human beings. Also saying, you know, God is both, can be found both in peace and in war. Actually, we've got this in the very first stanza when he says, Padre nuestro que estás en los cielos, golondrinas y los misiles. So you are in heaven with the swallows and the missiles. So, you know, both in peace and in war. And it says, please come back before you forget. So it's these people, everyone getting forgotten by God. Padre nuestro que estás en el exilio. Why in exile? Is it because human beings have put God in exile, or is God also found for those who are in exile? But the poetic voice says, you almost never think of my people. His people always at the end, at the back of the queue. We've got this reference to 1960, so we know exactly when the poetic voice, or when Mario Benedetti was writing this poem. The situation Latin America was in, Uruguay was in, he hadn't gone into exile yet, but it's a reference to the, you know, to the climate that was being felt then. He talks about our bitterness and fear, our indecisiveness and squalor, our hopelessness and inertia. So he asks, it's almost a rhetorical question, isn't it? Asking God, we will obviously never get an answer, but it's this questioning why this is happening, not expecting an answer, really. Then we've got obviously religious references to the Bible, with the rich man, the eye of the needle, the camel, and how, you know, human beings elected God unanimously for glory. But the Indian, el indio silencioso que te respetaba pero se resistía, again gets sidetracked and forgotten. In the following stanzas, we've got not so much this presence of the poetic voice and God, and the poetic voice just asking God, well, why have you forgotten about us? There is another presence almost in this stanza where he says, but who knows, it's not for me to decide, etc. It's almost this, tu poder se haga o se deshaga, tu voluntad igual se está haciendo en el viento. He's questioning who's got the power and whether those who have the power are using it in the right way. He continues with this. He talks about, obviously, the acreedores que perdonen, así como nosotros una vez por error perdonamos a nuestros deudores. The creditors forgive our debts as once by mistake we forgave our debtors. But he then really talks about how much people are suffering at the hands of people who really don't know how to employ government successfully. Todavía nos deben como un siglo de insomnios y garrotes. They still owe us about a century's worth of lost sleep and lashings, and about 2,000 miles of grievances. So then he talks about the dollar, the amor contra reembolso. So it's a poem questioning God, but also question probably humanity and power, and what we do once we hold the power, that no one should be forgotten. What do you think about the poem? Do you like it? You don't? It's very ironic, and as well, as Patricia was saying the Padre Nuestro, I was thinking that how, you know, we have all internalized our version of Padre Nuestro. Like, I only know it in Catalan. You, Leila, know it in Portuguese. So everyone knows, and is it, so we know it, we can read it, we can say it, we can recite it, but is it just like, is it the way we do it without thinking much about the message? So it's also a critique, I think, the poem to us, keeping to the surface of it without questioning what it exactly means, without questioning what, you know, never forgetting about anyone, never, or always forgiving everyone, and how we just recite things without really reflecting on the message behind it. So, but that only came to me as Patricio was saying the Padre Nuestro. Go ahead, yeah. As I said, and I think that I actually added this quote of by Margaret Randall, of how, even though his poetry is very much Uruguayan or Rioplatense, and it's very specific to a culture, the way he uses it makes it accessible to everyone else. And I think that this is pretty much an example of that. You are completely right. So, you know, most of us here know our Padre Nuestro in whatever language it is, and we get the wordplay, we get the irony, we see the Padre Nuestro in the different lines. I think that a younger audience, or an audience that was not so religious or that was familiar with the Padre Nuestro, would still get the ethical values, the humane values that the poem encapsulates. They would probably miss, you know, the references to the camello, el rico, el ojo de la aguja, no? But I think that they would probably still get the essence of the poem, which is about, you know, the power of the church, the power of governments, how the less fortunate are easily forgotten. I think that the values, the ethical values, the moral values behind the poem would be still accessible to everyone, even though that they might miss, you know, the fun parts, I think, of the poem. But that is a really good point. So probably if I were to teach this poem to my first year students in Liverpool, I would probably have to first show them a version of the Padre Nuestro before we embarked on reading the poem. So actually Leila's point about someone please reading Padre Nuestro for us was actually really good. Yes, absolutely, because this was pretty revolutionary in the 60s. And I need to mention that if you asked Benedetti about his, you know, beliefs, he would say that he was an atheist, or that he valued humane values and your conscience rather than God in general. But having said that, he has so many poems about God that pretty much defies the whole point. So he's a statement of being completely atheist, because that is a topic that he really did approach in his poetry. But that's true. So probably we wouldn't question how much of a rebellion this poem was at the time in 1960, when we read it now. Absolutely. I'm very conscious of the time and how we've read one poem in 45 minutes, but this was the longest poem that we will read. So unless someone has a very pressing idea that you would like to share with the rest, we will move on. No? Okay. So the next poem that I chose for you to read, and I'll try to move a lot quicker with this one, is Curriculum. Curriculum is this much shorter poem from Próximo Prójimo, from 1964 to 1965, and it says, El cuento es muy sencillo. Usted nace, contempla atribulado el rojo azul del cielo, el pájaro que emigra, el torpe escarbajo que su zapato aplastará valiente. Usted sufre, reclama por comida y por costumbre, por obligación, llora limpio de culpas, extenuado, hasta que el sueño lo descalifica. Usted ama, se transfigura y ama por una eternidad tan provisoria que hasta el orgullo se le vuelve tierno y el corazón profético se convierte en escombros. Usted aprende y usa lo aprendido para volverse lentamente sabio, para saber que al fin el mundo es esto, en su mejor momento una nostalgia, en su peor momento un desemparo y siempre, siempre un lío. Entonces, usted muere. So this poem is much shorter, as I said. It has 4 stanzas and a couplet, very different to the one that we've read. Is that how you say the pareado? That's right? Couplet, do you say? Yeah. And if we read the poem, I mean, I love the beginning, the first line that says, I think the Spanish is absolutely fantastic when it says, el cuento es muy sencillo. So this is a story. This is a story. It's the humor and the irony in the poem are fantastic. It's a curriculum, a CV, but in the form of in the shape form of a story. With this, if we look at the different stanzas, we've got birth at the beginning, life in the second, third, and fourth stanzas, and death, or if you want to be more precise, so birth in the first one, childhood in the second, you are young in the third, in the fourth it's maturity, but also when you are getting old. And finally, the couplet is death, okay? And this is all presented with humor, but also irony, because the CV could not be more, it's something in our day-to-day life. It's an object that has basically no value, or the value it has is that you present yourself to others in the way you want, not necessarily the way you are. So it's an interesting way. So it's something quite mechanical on a paper. It's a summary of our lives, of our achievements. So this is what I did. This is what I studied. This is my work experience. But in this poem, he's talking about his life, or how life is. Birth, childhood, young age, maturity, your elder age, and death. So it's a resume of a life, of this existence from birth to death, because the Spanish uses usted, so it appeals to the reader. We cannot escape it. It's our lives as well. It refers to, it calls us. It says, it's the same. You are also born, you've got a childhood, you get older, and you will die. So there is no escaping this poem. It's laughing at us, it's laughing with us. It's a way of seeing life, of making sense of it, of marking each crucial stage of our lives, if you want, in a different way, until the very end in the couplet, with this entonces, which marks, a change in the structure, a change almost in the tone. So this drastic change that, anticipates the ending, which is death. So it's a really, if we think about the theme in the poem, life, there is nothing more traditional than this. I mean, life and death are, themes that poetry really, really deals with. But it's done in a very, funny way, ironic way, humoristic way, maybe desmitificando. Yeah, we remove the myth around life, birth, death, etc. But maybe it challenges us to think about life and how we go through it. So that's why I selected the poem. I just thought that it was a nice poem to really prompt us to think about these different stages in life and what we make of it, how, we might present it in this very mechanical way, but obviously we attach meanings, very specific meanings to each of these stages. So I don't know if you've got any comments, if you did like the poem, if you didn't, what your thoughts were. I can see someone, Miguel Angel Sanchez. He's got a comment about the first poem. I highly recommend comparing it with poems by Ernesto Cardenal. Okay, that's our homework for later today, comparing Un Padre Nuestro Latinoamericano to the Nicaraguan Ernesto Cardenal Salmos and Psalms series. That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Miguel Angel, for the recommendation. What did we think about curriculum? Absolutely. That's why, because does the English version, for those of you native speakers, the story, does it evoke the Spanish one, el cuento? Because it's not la historia, it's el cuento, like a not a fairy tale, but it's a cuento. It's like a children's story. And I don't know if the English version conveys that meaning as well. Does it to you? Just very, very, very quickly, because I'm conscious that we've got like 3 minutes left. The other poem that I wanted to show you is this poem, Piedritas en la Ventana. I chose this poem because I think that it encapsulates extremely well this fight between optimism and pessimism that we have in Mario Benedetti's poetry. So this poem from the book Cotidianas from the late 1970s says, de vez en cuando la alegría tira piedritas contra mi ventana, quiere avisarme que está allí esperando, pero me siento calmo, casi diría ecuánime. Voy a guardar la angustia en un escondite y luego a tenderme cara al techo, que es una posición gallarda y cómoda para filtrar noticias y creerlas. ¿Quién sabe dónde quedan mis próximas huellas, ni cuándo mi historia va a ser computada? ¿Quién sabe qué consejos voy a inventar aún y qué atajo hallaré para no seguirlos? Está bien, no jugaré al desahucio, no tatuaré el recuerdo con olvidos. Mucho queda por decir y callar, y también quedan uvas para llenar la boca. Está bien, me doy por persuadido, que la alegría no tire más piedritas. Abriré la ventana, abriré la ventana. So, as you can see in this poem, we basically have the poetic voice fighting against itself. The first stanza, we've got this poetic voice locked inside, so locked in sadness or protecting itself from any sort of happiness. And happiness, which is as personified, throws all these pebbles at the window. So, asking, let me in, I want to be, bring happiness into your life. Then the second stanza, the poetic voice seems to, rethink his perspective of life, maybe, deciding to leave sadness behind, or, we've got all these rhetorical questions that will prompt the poetic voice to decide to leave sadness behind. And the third and fourth stanzas, the poetic voice surrenders and says, okay, so despite everything, I'll let happiness in. And remember, so, Mario Benedetti had the pessimism running deep in his veins, but his stay in Cuba gave him certain optimism, he says, that then remained in his poetry. So we do have this happiness fighting against this sense of doom and gloom and being there, not really knowing what to do with happiness, but happiness being something that persists, that keeps throwing the pebbles. So happiness is always there if we know how to listen to it, and we let it in, we allow it in. So it's almost a reminder to allow ourselves to be happy, to allow happy situations, to not lock ourselves in. So I wanted to read at least a happy poem, or a poem that, you know, was a call to happiness. I'll just mention a couple of the poems that I added there. So there is one about exile, a beautiful, beautiful poem about exile that I thought resonated so much with what we are seeing in the world now, with the refugees and people moving around. It's a really, really powerful poem. The way he talks about being homeless, about finding where you belong, finding your roots, finding people who understand you. So it's not just having a place to live, but it's people who can understand where you come from and what you've lived. So I do recommend reading that poem as well. And the other one that I wanted to read today, but obviously we just don't have time, was one called Palabra. And it's about the power of the word. So he says, palabra, what does it mean? 7 letters, there's nothing in it. It's an empty word. And obviously the wordplay with it being a word. It doesn't mean anything until you put it together with other words. So palabra needs other words to make sense of what it means. And he said, you know, I want to be this palabra, empty of meaning, just 7 letters. But then I will not know the walls around me. I will not know anyone around me. I won't know, I'll be completely unaware of what everything else means. So maybe I do not really want to be a word. It's a lovely, lovely reflection on the power of the word, on the power of the palabra, and what we do with the palabra, and what we do with the word and poetry. Obviously, you know, it's a poem about poetry as well, but it's about how much power our words have, and how lucky we are to have a voice and being able to voice it. So we have to be very careful how we use those palabras, para bien o para mal. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. I'm really sorry. I talk so much that maybe I should choose only a couple of poems so that we didn't have to run so much through all of them. But these are the poems that I recommend you to read. And just a reminder, we'll be here again at the end of May, the 25th of May, when we will be looking at the poetry by Álvaro Mutis from Colombia. You've got my email there in case you've got any comments, anything that you want to get in touch with, just feel free to email me.